Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. As viewers know, at the end of the year, at the beginning of a new year, we try to spend a half hour with our two United States senators, kind of a review of what's happened and perhaps a look ahead at what's to come in the next session of Congress. So we're happy that U.S. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas could join us today. Senator, thanks very much for being with us.
Steve, thanks for having me on. I apologize we couldn't be there in person, but the death and funeral of President Bush pushed our legislative session out a little bit further in December. But it was a worthy reason to have a longer time in session to honor such a great man and a fine president.
Well, in fact, you've got quite a full agenda, and we ought to advise the audience, sort of an editor's footnote, more than that, that owing to your schedule, owing to the congressional schedule, owing to the AETN schedule, we are taping on December the 13th, a program that won't be seen until January 4th. So as is not unusual in these circumstances, we're going to be kind of talking thematically, if you will. It's been a pretty busy session of Congress so far, but let's begin with something of signal importance to a lot of folks in Arkansas, and that's the Farm Bill. This was a bipartisan measure. You found yourself unable to support it. Why?
Well, Steve, the Farm Bill, as I've said before, would be better called a food stamp bill. It spends almost $900 billion over a 10-year period, and almost 80% of that is food stamps. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of abuses in the food stamp program. Let me just give you one statistic to illustrate my point. Today, at a time of record low unemployment and record job creation, 40 million Americans are using food stamps. In 2009, at the depth of the last recession, only 33 million Americans were using food stamps. Earlier versions of the bill had some good provisions in terms of work requirements for, let's be honest, grown men without kids working 20 hours a week or doing volunteer work or even participating in government-paid job training. I don't think that's too much to ask. Now, the food stamp program is important in terms of providing a safety net for people who are down on their luck or have lost their job, who have kids that they do have to care for, maybe don't have the ability because of a mental or physical disability to hold a full-time job. But Arkansas taxpayers deserve better than a program that has grown explosively over the last 10 years, even as we have so many job openings all across our state and all across our country.
Well, you call it a food stamp bill, and that's certainly true in the terms of bulk of the funding. The appropriation goes to food stamps, but it's always been that way, has it not, Senator? Or at least it has for the last 4 decades.
It has been, but that's not a good way.
Nothing unusual about that, yeah.
No, but that's not a good reason to continue what I think is a unwise practice. Just because something's always been done a certain way doesn't mean it should continue to be done that way. I think we'd get a better deal for our farmers and ranchers and foresters, and we get better reforms to our food stamp program if we could consider those issues separately.
Well, in terms of the additional work requirements, critics of that, Senator, say that your approach was more punitive than was actually indicated, that there are already some existing work requirements in the statute, and two, that the fact that so many more Americans are still on in a post-recovery period owes to some structural changes, structural/demographic changes in the economy itself.
So on your first point, Steve, there are some nominal work requirements in the law. Unfortunately, states can waive those. That's one reason why under Obama-era regulations, we've seen such explosive growth, going from 33 million users at the depths of the last recession to 40 million users today at a time of record unemployment. We should require people who are able-bodied, who are adults, and who don't have kids to work 20 hours a week, or do job training that the federal government pays for, I should add, or do volunteer work. I don't think that's too much to ask at a time of record low unemployment.
Well, but owing to the structural shifts, sir, in the nature of the workforce and the economy, I've read some stuff that indicates that if we continue the program as is, we've already got, as you note, a record low unemployment rate, and yet a lot of people can't find work. It's not the work that they are suited to do, trained to do, or able to do.
Well, I mean, when I drive across Arkansas, I see a lot of help wanted or hiring now signs all across the state. That's the same thing I see when I travel around the country. I mean, the data shows that we have record low unemployment, that almost anyone who wants a job and who's willing to show up and do the job can get a job. Now, as I said, for people who have children that they have to care for, or for people who can't hold down most jobs because of a mental or physical disability, food stamps provides an important safety net. But for grown men without kids, they should be working, or they should be taking steps towards working.
Well, the bill that passed the Senate and the House went along with it was an example of a bipartisan approach to a problem. Had your side prevailed, we wouldn't have had a farm bill at all.
So I would dispute that. I think there's enough votes in the vote coalition for both the farm programs and the food stamp programs to pass those two bills independently. Just a few years ago, when I was in the House of Representatives, the House did just that. And as you know, the Senate is designed to be more attentive to rural concerns because each state, small states like ours, even smaller states like North Dakota or South Dakota, have two senators, just like big states like California and New York. It's the House that is supposed to be more directly responsive to population because those districts are the same. So if the House can pass a food stamp bill and a farm bill, the Senate should be able to as well.
Well, the traditional rural-urban coalition that coalesced around farm bills over the last really half century, you're calling that into question? Is it too cozy?
I have been for a long time. It's the kind of log-rolling politics that most Arkansans don't like, in my opinion. I think they would rather see us try to reform the food stamp program on its own merits, pass a farm bill on its own merits, and I think we can do so.
All right, on to sentencing reform, sir, and this is another aspect that suddenly there was a turnabout by the majority leader. At first he was going to kind of go along with your side, and now, wait a minute, we're going to have a vote after all. What happened?
Well, first off, I would say that this is a sentencing reduction and criminal leniency bill. It's going to let thousands of serious, repeat, and even violent offenders out of prison early. There were parts of this bill earlier this year I could support. The parts of the bill that are designed to address our recidivism problem. Too many prisoners leave prison and then commit future crimes. We should give them chances to get back on their feet, not be a menace to society after they've paid their debt to society. So providing GED classes, for instance, or job and technical training, mentoring and counseling, especially faith-based types of counseling. Unfortunately, this bill went in the direction of criminal leniency and sentencing reduction. I don't think we should be weakening three strikes laws or giving liberal judges more opportunities to give serious criminals shorter sentences. We are going to debate this bill, and that's in part because the president announced his support for it, and many other senators have announced their support as well. Senator McConnell, the majority leader, doesn't make decisions based on his own personal preferences. He waits to see where there's consensus in the Senate or within his own party, and if a bill has enough support, potentially, until it faces the amendment process, he'll bring it to the floor and there'll be an open and honest debate. And that's what I look forward to having on this bill.
Well, you mentioned, for example, Senator, liberal judges. Rather, a few conservative judges have complained about the sentencing code as well, that it ties their hands, that it's inappropriate. The code itself is often inappropriate to the offense. And again, here was a great many in your party are for the, whatever you call it, criminal leniency, they call it sentencing reform, but it's got several monikers.
So Steve, I'll grant that there are rare cases in which the facts of the case and the law can interact in a way that might produce what most normal Arkansans would consider a manifestly unjust sentence. In those cases, I think we're better off using the president's power to commute sentences or to pardon, which is a scalpel approach, rather than using the axe approach of sentencing reduction legislation. Because there's no doubt we're going to release several serious, repeat, and violent offenders from prison under this legislation, and it's an almost mathematical certainty that some of them will commit heinous crimes. However, if you use the president's power to commute sentences, those sentences that are clearly and manifestly unjust in a particular case, you're taking a scalpel to the problem rather than an axe or a sledgehammer.
So how could a president have time, sir, to, we've got critics of the sentencing grid now say that you've got hundreds of thousands. The U.S. is drowning in incarcerated felons. How could a president possibly take the time to review all of those unjust cases?
So there's an entire office within the Department of Justice that reviews petitions for pardon or just simply for clemency or commutation of sentences. The Department of Justice under the Obama administration, with President Obama's final approval, released hundreds or even thousands of prisoners in specific cases, some of which I have no objection to. But I don't think we should take a sledgehammer to the problem of sentencing reduction. Now, you talk about the hundreds of thousands or even millions of prisoners in this country. It may be the case in some states that they have sentencing laws with which I would disagree or you would disagree. But in the federal system, we've gone from over 220,000 prisoners down to less than 180,000 prisoners. So we've already released a lot of people from prison over the last 10 years. And if you're in the federal prison, you're usually a very serious offender. We don't lock up many first-time, nonviolent, low-level offenders in federal prison. I mean, there's a reason why in our culture, "don't make a federal case out of it" is a saying that most people understand.
It's a problem also at the state level, Senator, too. How much of this is fiscally driven?
So you're right that at the state level, as I said, there may be some states that have sentencing laws with which I would disagree. I'm not aware of that in Arkansas. I know in Arkansas, we go to great lengths to try to divert, for instance, veterans who have become addicted to drugs into veterans court. We do the same thing in drug court with other offenders. There are not many first-time, low-level nonviolent offenders in Arkansas prisons either. Those who do get in usually have pretty short sentences and can be released early on parole. States do face constrained budgets for prisons since they are the primary law enforcement governments in this country. However, I would put law enforcement and public safety at the state and local level up there with national security and our defense at the federal level. One of the fundamental obligations of government is to keep its citizens safe. That's true whether it's a foreign threat or whether it's domestic crime.
Certainly at the state level, Senator, and I suspect too, I haven't checked it at the federal level or read the latest research, much of the inmate population is drug-driven, narcotics-driven. Do you think we should take, as a nation, a new approach, not necessarily a 180, but maybe a 175 toward how we regard the whole nature of drug and narcotic offenses?
Well, I think, Steve, that there has been something of a mindset shift over the last 10 or 15 years, recognizing that drug addiction is a genuine health problem and that we should focus on getting drug addicts the treatment they need, and that locking up someone for, say, simple possession of marijuana or locking up a heroin addict who simply possesses heroin is not very sound public policy. It's better to divert them into a drug court, divert them into some kind of drug treatment program. However, for drug dealers and drug traffickers, frankly, I don't have a lot of sympathy for them, especially when they're repeat offenders. And I think it would send a terrible message, and it would be very bad for the safety of our communities and our families if we were to decriminalize or even legalize serious narcotics in this country.
Well, other nations have tried it, and to some varying extents, they say it seems to work better than the system that we have. I'd like your thoughts on that.
There are a lot of different factors that go into that, a lot of different social, economic, cultural, historical factors, geographical factors as well. I just think it would be a very bad and unwise public policy for our nation if we were to decriminalize or legalize drugs, especially if we were to start being lenient on repeat large-time felons.
Well, it's crystal ball time here. Now, again, we're on, December the 13th here. Now, there is the possibility, it would appear, of a lame duck. Well, we're already in lame duck, but I mean a session between Christmas and New Year's over a budget matter. What does this suggest? What does it portend for the January session?
Well, I think it really depends on what happens over these next few days on the spending bills we still have left to consider. Remember, we've funded most of the government. Earlier this year, we funded the Department of Defense, the Department of Health and Human Services, which administers programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and so forth.
The big money.
So there are the biggest pots of money, about 70 to 75% of the entire government is funded until next fall. Obviously, if there's not a long-term funding bill for the rest of the government, some of the smaller agencies and departments this month, then we'll have to revisit that in the new year and clean up this Congress's work in the new Congress. I hope that's not the case, because it's not a good way to spend the taxpayer money to use short stopgap measures because it ultimately costs more money to keep the departments running on those terms. But I also hope that we can fulfill our promises to the voters, one of which is to secure our southern border and begin to construct walls and fences in places that are needed on the border. I can't say how that's going to play out. It's in part in Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats' hands, and whether or not they're going to vote to support something that most of them have already voted for. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi in the past have voted to build 700 miles of fencing on our southern border. They simply never funded it. I hope that we can resolve it this month, though, so in the new Congress we can turn our attention to new priorities for the new year.
Is it worth a shutdown? Hopefully there won't be one, but is it worth a shutdown?
I don't want to see those departments or agencies shut down over the holidays. It's disruptive to the public. It's disruptive to the many fine public servants we have in those departments and agencies, many of whom work in Arkansas. At the same time, I want to make sure that we're securing our southern border, which is what the president wants as well. We'll have to see again what Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats are willing to negotiate towards. I hope we can find some kind of bipartisan agreement, and I hope that sets the stage in January for working towards shared or common priorities where we can find shared ground. There may not be quite as much shared ground with the House of Representatives over the next 2 years as there has been over the last 2 years with Nancy Pelosi in charge, but I do hope that we can continue to do the people's business.
Well, Mr. Trump says it is worth it. It would be worth it, and he's fully prepared, he says. Of course, we're looking backward again now, but he says he's fully prepared to shut it down. Is it worth it to you for that border funding?
I want to make sure that we secure our border, some of which means building a wall and building fences where appropriate. We ultimately have to see what Chuck Schumer and Senate Democrats are willing to offer. I don't want to see the government shut down any more than you or any more than most Arkansans do. But I'm not the only one with a vote in this. There's a lot of other senators who have a vote as well.
Well, he spent 2 years, Mr. Trump, promising everyone that Mexico would pay for this border security, pay for the border wall. Why don't you send the bill to them?
Well, there's still ways that we could do that in the long term, Steve. But I think he's most concerned about getting control of our southern border, given some of the threats that we have, some of the threats we've already been discussing, like the narcotics trade or human trafficking, for instance. But I do hope that we can come to a resolution on this matter this month and start the new year on new priorities.
Well, let's look ahead to the next session of the Congress. You noted that the control of the House will flip. And the Democrats will be in charge. What does that portend for the climate? Now we're in a new election cycle, already in a new election cycle, indeed a presidential election cycle.
Well, you're right, Steve. We're already getting into a presidential election cycle with Democrats beginning to declare their candidacies. We may have half of the Senate Democratic caucus running for president by the time we're done for it. But I think in the Senate, we'll continue to do our business. We're in the personnel business. We have to confirm the president's nominees to the federal courts and to the executive branch. So whatever happens from a legislative standpoint, we'll be busy confirming a lot of the nominees that have been unjustly delayed over the last 2 years. Obviously, we still have to find common ground with the House Democrats every year to fund the government, to fund our military, to fund programs like the national parks or basic scientific research, federal law enforcement, and so forth. I hope that we can do that without too much rancor or discord. I do think there'll be some possible grounds for bipartisan cooperation as well. The president came to office hoping to pass a new infrastructure package. He wasn't able to do that over the last 2 years. Frankly, I think Nancy Pelosi believed that she would win back the House of Representatives and that they could get a better deal on Democratic terms if they waited until 2019. Well, it turns out she was right about that. So congratulations to her. I hope now we can put the politics aside and try to get get a new infrastructure package that'll help all of America.
What will that bill look like, sir? Is there any way of looking? Because the consensus here is we need a highway bill pretty bad.
Yeah, so obviously infrastructure package would focus on roads and bridges and highways. I do think, though, for rural Arkansas, and probably big cities as well, you need to think in a broader fashion in the 21st century for an infrastructure package. For instance, rural broadband is very important to economic growth and education in so many of our communities. I think that should be considered part of infrastructure in the 21st century. We've seen problems in a lot of major cities and some of our smaller towns as well with water systems. That should be considered part of an infrastructure package too. railroads and ports, those are important to Arkansas's economy as well. So roads and highways are usually going to be a central part of any infrastructure package, given that that's where most of the money is. But I do think we need to think in a broader fashion if we move forward with the infrastructure package to help all Arkansans in all aspects of modern infrastructure.
Well, you also have to think about the fiscal implications of it, Senator, too. We've got a tax bill that's now at work, and what kind of constraints will the fiscal outlook impose, if any?
Well, the fiscal outlook is not good. However, the federal government just collected more in tax revenue than it has in any previous year. So I would submit that we don't have a tax problem, we have a spending problem. And we can be more disciplined in the way we spend our money. Just take the infrastructure, for instance. It costs more to build a mile of road in the United States than to build one in France. And France is a socialist country. There's lots that we can do when it comes to red tape and bureaucracy, permitting and approvals that help communities build their roads faster, build a bypass in a year as opposed to 4 years, to get the kind of expedited and streamlined approvals they need to start laying pavement and getting people driving on those roads that people need without it costing so much. So people focus a lot on the revenue side in terms of how you pay for it. We should look at the spend side as well and whether we're spending every dollar of the taxpayers' money in the wisest fashion we can.
Well, federal revenues indeed are up, sir, but so is the deficit by like 18% over the last year. That's only for 9 months, I think, after the fiscal of the fiscal year just ended. And the president seems to have put both the Pentagon and social programs off limits. That doesn't leave you any maneuvering room, does it?
Yeah, well, I'd say that the Pentagon is a special case. As we were talking about earlier in the criminal justice context, the most fundamental obligation of our federal government is to keep our country safe. And for many years, frankly, due to decisions in both parties, our military has been starved of the resources it's needed. We do have the start of a rebuild of our military over the last 2 years, but that needs to continue. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Armed Services Committee, on which I sit, heard testimony from a bipartisan commission that said that the proposal that the president put on the table was too little money. The president has since changed that because he recognizes that we face a growing threat not only from terrorism, which remains serious, but from rival nation states like China and Russia and rogue nation states like North Korea and Iran. So that's a fundamental part of the federal government's obligation. And ultimately, too, international security and peace provides the conditions and context for a healthy, growing economy. But I would just say, because you're right that deficits have increased, but federal revenues have increased as well, which suggests that we have more of a spending problem and that we could probably tighten our belt in other places rather than the military.
Well, you've got to look at CBO estimates are like they vary, $2 to $3 trillion over the next decade. You've got enough room to. Safety is one issue, but solvency is another.
No, that's right. And ultimately, our national debt could have consequences that could imperil our prosperity and our security. As interest rates increase and we spend more just to pay the interest on the national debt, that means there's less money to go around for everyone, less money for people on Social Security and Medicare, less money for our military, less money for law enforcement and so forth. I just don't think the problem is that our taxes are too low. The problem is that our spending is too high, and that's reflected in the most recent year's data that we have more tax revenue than we've ever had before.
Again, this is December the 13th, Senator. Will President Trump finish this term? There's legal trouble all around him, and we keep hearing reliable. Well, you can see it on television every night from the White House itself. Seems to be a pretty chaotic environment there, and one that is legally treacherous.
I have no reason to believe that he will not, Steve. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. I'm privy to a lot of information that's not public. We are conducting our own investigation, as you know, into Russia's interference in the political campaigns of 2016. There's no doubt that happened. However, I'll agree with what some of my Democratic colleagues have said. I've seen no evidence of collusion between Russia and any person affiliated with the Trump campaign or in the Republican Party.
Well, we have the campaign finance issue also, Senator.
Well, but that has nothing to do with the collusion matter that we've been looking into and that Special Counsel Mueller has been investigating. I understand that there's a lot of controversy and a lot of people engage in speculation about what's happening. I'm not inside those investigations. I obviously don't have access to the grand jury information. I'll wait and see what happens as facts develop and become public. But as of now, I've seen no evidence of collusion between Russia and people associated with the Trump campaign or the Republican Party. I have seen a lot of evidence of Russian misconduct, and we've taken steps to try to prevent that from happening in the future.
Russia aside, though, Senator, the campaign finance aspect in the Southern District of New York, how treacherous do you see the president's footing here?
Steve,
seconds remaining. I'm sorry.
Steve, I mean, I'm not privy to the investigation that's going on in the Southern District at its grand jury. I know that there have been guilty pleas, but I don't think you can infer the facts or the truth from a single man's guilty plea who's trying to reduce his sentence. We'll have to wait until the prosecutors and the grand jury continue their investigation and make public more of their facts.
We're simply out of time. Senator Cotton, thanks very much. Thank you for being with us. Always a pleasure. We'll see you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.